There are 20 races in Anbennar, and today I'll be ranking them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. This has been highly requested by one person, very highly requested to be clear by that one person, so I guess I have to concede and well reintroduce the tier list format. But as always in these cases, we'll be ranking them based on their strength within both single player and multiplayer, and indeed because Anbennar enjoyers tend to have their favourite nations or races more based on lore than objective reality, I think it's important again to remind you that during these tier lists we have to rank things by objective strength and not by arbitrary metrics like enjoyment or fun. I cannot rank enjoyment. If you happen to enjoy light ship combat ability, well, I hope you get better soon. That said, the rankings will take into account special unlocks such as the Gnome early access to Artificery. It is also important to mention that the usual single player ranking is based on strength to finish World Conquest, where naturally the ability to blob is the most important modifier. Now this remains somewhat still true in Anbennar for single player, but since a lot of Anbennar single player content, well, most Anbennar single player content actually involves overcoming in-game challenges and completing missions, we almost get a case of multiplayer rankings even in single player in the sense of you need your single player country built like an MP country to be able to survive these disasters or finish these missions. In terms of other necessary disclaimers, because you can mix and match your military and primary administrations, there will be 2 rankings for every available race, namely for their administrative and military abilities, and since undead or spirit isn't a race, we will not be ranking undead armies or spirit armies as part of this tier list, considering this is a race tier list and not a conceptually possible armies tier list. Finally, the tier list format I know tends to be enjoyed by a lot of people as, shall we say, background music, so I'll do my best to make sure I read out any modifiers I am discussing to help support that. And with that all said, I'm also pleased to announce the new deadpan lemon cake I made by hobbling together a couple of the other Father Loris lemon cakes. For those wondering, yes, as mentioned before, the new lemon cakes were made by Father Loris. If you by some miracle haven't seen Chapel Comics, go change that. But yeah, this self-made deadpan lemon cake is here to join us on this journey because this discussion about how good each Anbennar race is needs him. And yeah, let's get the usual things out of the way as well. A like would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing, but enough self-shilling. We'll be ranking them by their administrations first, then by their militaries later. Timestamps will be provided, and let's begin with humans. So humans as bonuses, you get minus 2.5% all power cost and minus 25% culture conversion cost. That's it, and you also get no negatives, which in Anbennar is actually pretty good. Quite a few other administrations and also militaries have a bunch of negatives attached to them. This is kind of the human classic thing in fantasy trope, as it were. They're the super adaptable kind of chaps that kind of get around everywhere and also tend to not have any kind of extra bonuses, jack of all trades kind of builds. And that's very much what human administration is. Minus 2.5% all power cost just basically means that you have minus 2.5% tech cost, you have minus 2.5% dev cost, you have all of these small percentages you'd think would be relevant, like, you know, idea cost, all these good things, right? You just have minus 2.5% of it on. So yeah, it's nice. Every time you're spending monarch points, this is going to save you monarch points. It's good on that regard. It's actually a pretty nice modifier. Now, not a lot of it. Minus 2.5 all power cost is very like you have to go out of your way to stack all power cost, but it's going to add up over the course of your campaign and will end up saving you quite a few monarch points as you play. They're also pretty good at one specific thing for blobbing, then is of course the culture conversion cost. And they're also good at what I like to call tall blobbing, in the sense that if you're trying to build around dev cost in primary, which is a very Republic kind of build, so Republics have access to a couple dev costs in primary, and a couple Anbennar tags also have access to dev costs in primary, you're going to want to have some culture conversion costs to be able to convert into your primary culture and hence be able to use that. And humans, they actually don't have 25% culture conversion cost, they have 27.5% because all power cost also includes culture conversion costs, so that's nice. The other thing that's important to mention with all power cost, of course, is that having your first couple bits of all power cost is actually quite good, because having like 1% all power cost already means that generals go from 50 to 49, your cores go from 100 to 99, you know, all those kind of things. So just having that little bit of all power cost right off the bat on the board is nice, I find, compared to having literally 0, but you can also get it from innovativeness. If you just get to like 10 innovativeness, you've got your 1% all power cost from that. So it's a bit hard to rank it in that regard. That said, though, humans aren't bad at any specific kind of administration. For that reason, they're just not as amazing as other things are. And because a lot of both Anbennar and EU4 tends to revolve around making a build around, for example, vassals, making a build around, for example, having really good troops that stab everything, making a build around, even if I said it as a joke earlier, light ship combat ability, well, humans aren't really going to be good at any specific builds. And even for things like one culture runs, you don't tend to struggle with culture conversion cost as much as you struggle with the conquest, especially in something like Anbennar. So for that reason, humans aren't a bad administration because they have literally, you know, debuffs, But this lack of specialization in a game that really prioritizes and rewards specialization is, I think, going to be holding them back quite noticeably. And for that reason, humans will be going into the B tier here. Right, so that's our first placement. And with that, we will now, of course, move on to our halflings. So this will be the next of our representations. Halflings are an interesting, shall we say, administration to have. So in terms of bonuses, halflings pick up 20% improved relations, they pick up 10% trade efficiency, they get 0.03 monthly war exhaustion, 10 adventure loyalty modifier, and plus 20 global settlers. However, as debuffs, they get plus 30 harsh treatment cost, plus 10% mil tech cost, plus 15% construction time, and minus 20 max abs. Halflings are a bit unusual into how they actually want to say play optimally. The trade efficiency is good, and it's also good in wide empires because if you have a lot of land, you have a lot of land to trade company and really get trade going, and so trade efficiency will excel in those environments. But trade efficiency also excels if you're really small and you're stealing trade from other people, which is ironic in the halfling case because they tend to be, well, should we say, quite short as well. That said, improved relations is good for expansion because improved relations is basically AE reduction, as improved relations helps you take AE down faster. And global settler increase of plus 20% is actually relatively rare. A lot of colonizers, shall we say, tend to actually have negative global settler increases, but it's a bit of a misnomer because, for example, Vanale is, I'd argue, one of the best, if not the best, colonizers in Anbennar, and they are Elven Administration. They have a debuffed global settler increase, but their missions give them like plus 200 global settlers, so it's entirely offset by that regard. That being said, of course, if you are playing Vanale very optimally, going halfling as Vanale probably makes all the Vanale enjoyers out there cry, but would be more optimal. So it's something to bear in mind with that said. Now, in terms of their actual administration and abilities, I think the best way of describing what halflings are good at is playing a Netherlands-like roleplay campaign, because you're going to be good at colonizing, you're going to be good at getting a lot of trade efficiency and building a trade empire, but you're actually not going to be good at blobbing, and it's going to sound ironic to that, but the minus 20 max abs means that late game, or shall I say post-absolutism blobbing, is going to be hurt by that. Getting that max abs overcome by that minus 20 is going to be really, really annoying, and it's going to hold you back because it means that you can't really run extra privileges. You have to be very, very tight on your estates to be able to squeeze out anything extra from them. And that harsh treatment cost doesn't really come up unless you specifically want to do the harsh treatment stack to minus 100% thing to get absolutism. So you have a harder time getting absolutism, you have a harder time getting max abs. The mil tech cost plus 10% is also consistently annoying. It means that in environments like multiplayer, you're going to have a harder time staying up to date on Miltech, because up to date on Miltech in multiplayer is basically 15 Miltechs ahead. Because if you're not getting Miltech 6 early, your opponent's getting Miltech 6 early and you're dying. If you're not getting Miltech 15 early, your opponent's getting Miltech 15 early and you're getting screwed. In single player, it doesn't matter that much. It does mean that if you're trying to get Miltech 6 early again to try and get an early war done, you're going to have a harder time doing it. But it's okay if you're taking Miltech, shall we say, slightly behind, and you have debuffs to tech from neighbor penalty and so on. Well, I say debuffs, buffs to tech from neighbor penalty, then you're going to be able to overcome that, so it's not that big of a deal in specifically single player environments. What I think the halflings kind of are good for is ironically colonial trade empires, and especially with that adventure loyalty equilibrium, which by the way kind of mentions that, but the adventurers have some events associated with colonizing, I do believe, and it's nice to have them in general happy with you, but not that big of a deal. And Halfling Administration in that regard, because they keep your adventurers more loyal, will then have a bit of a synergy with themselves if you go for Halfling Military, because they tend to be very mercenary based. So that's kind of something to bear in mind, that usually for everyone else, adventurer loyalty isn't that relevant because it's basically the mercenary state, but for Halfling specifically, that can kind of matter. And if you're trying to make a mercenary build, Halfling Administration actually isn't an awful thing to go into. That said, it's weird because you want to go wide with it, but you're pert doing wide with it, and you don't have that many bonuses to tour, and actually you have a slight debuff to being tall, namely that construction time does mean that if you're trying to build up your nation, you're going to have a bit of a harder time doing that because you'd rather be conquering buildings. That plus 15% construction time can get pretty annoying, because bear in mind for something like 365 days, like if it's the time to build a workshop, that plus 10% already would be like an extra month. So you're in practice adding like 50 days onto every single temple and workshop. And if it's something like a manufactory, you're adding an extra year on top of every single workshop. Instead of on top of every single manufactory. So it's something to really bear in mind. And that construction time can very much skewer the return on investment on a lot of buildings for halflings. So it's awkward to build like tall with them. And the other thing to bear in mind is that other tall races will have bonuses to production efficiency or even goods produced or taxes. And you don't really have that. You just have trade efficiency. So you're, if anything, really incentivized to just go tall, but like Netherlands type tall, where you're also stealing trade from other people. So that's something to bear in mind in that regard. But yeah, halflings are weird, but at least they can be specialized for colonial empires or tall empires like that. And I think the specialization puts them consistently above humans. 10% trade efficiency is also just a good economic modifier. Monthly war exhaustion lets you keep fighting, although usually be fighting on the defense, so I'd say. And global settler increase plus 20% is actually relatively rare in Anbennar. Most administrations actually nerf it. So overall, halflings are going to be earning a rightful spot on the A tier for me. And with that, we move on to our next chaps, and that's going to be, of course, our half-elves. Half-elves are significantly more specialized, if that makes sense, administration than everything else. So the half-elves inherit a bit of that human all-power cost of minus 1%, and I've mentioned this previously on the minus 2.5% for the humans, but if you skipped here or something, well, to be clear again, just having 1% is relatively nice, because it means generals go from 50 to 49, and so on and so forth, so that's good. But also, half-elves pick up minus 20% dip annexation, plus 1 dip relations, plus 1 dip rep, and 20% improved relations. This is just really good for subject builds, because you're going to be able to annex them 20% cheaper if you combine this with influence and administrative. That is already going to be minus 60%. So if you're going half-elf administration, make sure you pick up a country that actually has some dip annexation cost inside of their missions as well, or inside of their ideas. You'll be able to dip annex for min price as well, which is very good. So a recommendation if you're doing that. And it's very much, again, a subject-based build, because your debuffs are plus 10% core creation, minus 10 max abs, minus 15% reform progress growth, and minus 10% unjustified demands. Those are all just bad. Unjustified demands really hurt your specifically dip points for expansion, and then you're going to need those dip points to annex. Core creation cost means that you don't really want to be coring that much. I mean, 10% core creation cost isn't that bad, but it's something to bear in mind. Minus 10 max abs is just annoying, but at least a bit more overcomable than minus 20, and minus 15% reform progress growth is just consistently bad. And this is something you have to really bear in mind with half-elf administration, is that this almost forces you into a vassal build, because if you don't do a vassal build with half-elf administration, most of your buffs don't really do anything. Improved relations is a bit, helpful, for lack of a better word, for dealing with coalitions, and dip relations and dip rep are again a bit useful for dealing with coalitions, because you can grab some allies extra sometimes, but that's about it. All you're getting, if you're not doing a vassal build with half-elf administration, is minus 1% all power cost, practically, and again, some AE reductions to improve relations, but you're paying for that with 10% CCR, which is going to hurt. You're paying for that with minus 10% unjustified demands, which is going to hurt, and more importantly, you're going to pay for that with minus 15% reform progress growth, which is going to consistently hurt. So it's something to really bear in mind. Half-elf administration, if you're not doing a vassal build, is going to be bad, and if you are going to be doing a vassal build, that reform progress growth and unjustified demands, and even the max abs, is going to be noticeable, because remember, absolutism also impacts your dip annexation cost, because it is affected by your administrative efficiency that you get from abs. So for that reason, it's something of a weird, like, double-edged sword, where it's only a usable sword, or I guess double-edged sword is a bit of a wrong misnomer here. It's a sword that's facing you, and you can sharpen it into a double-edged sword that you can use to stab your opponents, but make sure you do that, because that way you at least have a sword that stabs two ways instead of a sword that just stabs you in the face. So that's kind of my issue with half administration. But because of that dip annexation cost and all those bonuses to vassals, and the specific strength of that build, I don't think it's the best build, but I think it's a pretty strong build to build around vassals. Half administration is going to be very comfortably also sitting in the B tier. The debuffs, if you're doing the specific builds for it, for example, so doing a vassal build and still having that reform progress growth for me is kind of the thing that's keeping it in B tier for me. With that though, we move on to the elves, no half-elves around here, and the elf administration is certainly one of the administrations of all time. Let's make sure we're on the same page on that one. So what do elves get as positives? Elves get plus 1 dip reputation, much as their half-elf cousins, but they also pick up plus 10% tax and production efficiency, as well as minus 1 prestige decay and 25% improved relations. They also get plus 20 length of election term, 25% female advisor chance, the ability to recruit female generals, and now onto the negatives, minus 40 global settlers, plus 5 tech cost, plus 33% institution embracement cost, and minus 33% institution spread. So what are elves good at? Well, honestly, just being strong, right? Let's get it off rip. The plus 1 dip rep is consistently nice in the same way that the half-elves get, but it's the least of their bonuses. Plus 10% national tax and production efficiency. The tax is good early game, the production efficiency is better late game, and the tax, honestly, it's never bad. Like, what happens is tax income gets outscaled, but you can definitely still build around tax and have a decent amount of taxes coming in, especially if you're doing the temple spam that you probably should be doing in Anbennar because there's a lot of high development everywhere. The improved relations of plus 25% is even better than the plus 20% and combines with prestige decay to basically let you sit at 100 prestige as much as you possibly can. And this is obviously strong because 100 prestige has minus 10% AE flat, as well as also impacting your prestige decay, well, sorry, AE decay, because you get plus 50% improved relations if you're sitting at 100 prestige. So basically, you're just able to sit at 100 prestige easier, and that's a good thing, right? Because mainly for the blobbing, it also gives you morale of armies and navies and those good things. Now, obviously, minus 1% prestige decay isn't plus 10 morale of armies. Let's make sure we're not equating that, or even minus 10 AE impact, and you're able to get to 100 prestige without needing prestige decay, for example. However, it certainly helps, and it's something to mention in that regard. Elves can just start strong and keep going strong. The early tax and production can be helpful for, again, scaling your economy. You don't have any construction time debuffs or construction cost things to slow down your scaling. And again, the prestige decay and improved relations help you conquer faster. They're surprisingly good at going wide without any flat bonuses to GovCap or anything else we're going to see of that nature. But we now have to talk about their debuffs. Global Settler increase of minus 40 means that unless you're Vanale and specifically have a mission tree for colonizing, don't colonize as elves. The tech cost is annoying and something you have to be consciously overcoming all the time, and it gets even worse when you realize that institution spread and institution embracement cost. If you're going wide, an institution embracement cost of plus 33% means that it's going to be just extra painful to embrace the institutions, and the institution spread means that it's going to be extra painful to spread the institutions. What this means is that compared to a nation that doesn't have these debuffs, you're going to have to spend more effort on institutions, and also compared to another nation that will be able to embrace an institution, let's say 1510, you're going to be able to get it in 1520, because you're probably just a bit bigger than them, because you'll be able to expand a bit faster because of the extra tax production and impacts. And more importantly, they don't have minus 3% institution spread and the extra costs associated with that. And so what can end up happening is you'll end up either not taking a tech when you want to be taking a tech, or taking a tech at extra cost, which combines with your tech cost as well on top of it. In practice, what makes this even worse is that elves, in many ways, tend to be running a lot of major states and trying to build around mages, or at least quite a few. Elves tend to do that, and so what happens is that this tech cost gets combined with extra tech cost and becomes even more painful, and it's something to bear in mind as an actually active thing for you to manage. Now, it's absolutely manageable if you do, well, shall we say, dev your institutions or be aware of institutions being an issue and plan around that. And I won't even say get some debuffs to tech cost, but make sure you're running good advisors to be able to overcome that plus 5% tech cost and everything. It's absolutely manageable. It's not plus 50% tech cost, it's plus 5. Absolutely fine. You also don't have any debuffs to stab costs or any other things that give you extra instability for your nation. So for that reason, it's a surprisingly good going wide build. But also, even if you do go wide or go tall, the 10% national tax and production efficiency means that whatever land you do have, you tend to be using it actually rather, well, good. It's not just produced as a bonus, the strongest economic bonus, but it's consistently nice for both tax and production builds, and that's kind of where your money comes from as well. So honestly, Elven Administration is just consistently nice. Where it does for me fall down is, of course, if you're trying to run a republic. 20 length of election terms means, frankly, you may as well not have elections because they're going to take forever. And, I mean, female advisor chance and recruit female generals. A couple of administrations has this just basic glorified flavor text, let's be honest. But length of election terms means the one thing I would not recommend with elves is bothering with republics. It kind of ruins it. And if you're thinking, okay, but I have an election every, 25 years, that means I'll be able to sit on a republican tradition. You wouldn't, because each election is going to take, minus 25 if you re-elect the same guy, so that's something to really bear in mind. And a lot of, I think, elven meta, if that even makes any sense, is basically just trying to get us one really good ruler, and just because they live for 400 years, sticking with them as long as possible. So in general, I would not recommend republics if you are an elf. If you're an elf and want to stay an elf, get out of republic as soon as you possibly can. That said, though, they are, in the same way that humans are consistent, they're also consistent in both expansion and economic management, but they also scale well if you're trying to build around taxes, or if you're trying to build around production efficiency, or if you're trying to build around a mitigation with prestige decay and improved relations. So consistently nice and consistently good to have. Elves very comfortably also earn an 80th spot in my books. And with that, we move on to the dwarves. So the dwarves are a very popular nation to play within Anbennar because there's quite a few of them. They have a lot of content, they have a lot of missions, and so on and so forth. In terms of their actual dwarven administration, they pick up a pretty massive 20% production efficiency, as well as minus 5% mil tech cost. So fort maintenance on border with rivals, 25% reduced inflation cost, and minus 10% construction time. In terms of negatives though, we have plus 12 length of election term, and now the list begins in earnest. Minus 30 global settlers, plus 10 dip tech cost, minus 25 improved relations, chain driver cost of plus 100%, promote culture cost of plus 100%, minus 10 spine network construction, and plus 30% stab cost modifier. That final plus 30% stab cost modifier means that if you're a dwarf and you have any kind of issues going around, it's going to cost you an extra 30 admin to stab up for flat as a modifier, right? The thing is with dwarves is they tend to have a lot of issues running around. The dwarves are rather famously 50 billion disasters happening at the same time, so that plus 30% stab cost is extra painful for specifically dwarves. In terms of bonuses though, that production efficiency means they are very good at self-scaling. That construction time also means they get their economy up faster than you'd expect, because it means that you basically get a temple or a workshop up a month early. It's 365 days, you get 36 days off on that. And if you are building manufactories, you're saving half a year on a manu, going from 5 years to 4.5 years, which is noticeable. Like, that's a pretty good buff and able to let you get buildings online faster for scaling. The reduced inflation cost is also very nice if you do find a gold hold or have a lot of gold coming for you, because you're able to manually bite it down a lot cheaper. And the mil tech cost means that you're able to time your wars relatively well and grab mil tech costs when you need them, either to keep up with your opponents in multiplayer and also in single player. If you want to grab mil tech 4 against a mil tech 3 opponent, you're going to have a nicer time doing that with the dwarves. Unfortunately, your debuffs are pretty brutal. Global settler increase, if you're a dwarf, you're going to have to recolonize the dwarf raw, and you do get some bonuses and those kind of things to overcome that, but usually, unless again you're something like the Ruby Hole dwarves, the global settler increase is going to hurt. The dip tech cost is going to consistently hurt because you probably still want to be keeping up on dip techs, and dip dev is a good thing to dev, so it's going to hurt you at your dip points when you want the dip points. Improve relations, it's a bit of a weird one. Dwarves tend to not really suffer from coalition issues. By the time dwarves kind of emerge from the dwarf raw, and if you want to conquer beyond that and blob, you're not going to have any problems at that point. You're just going to be super strong. Change rival cost is cosmetic, but the promote culture cost is even more annoying though, because with dwarves, there's a lot of other cultures even within the dwarves themselves. And I know it's going to be heresy, but if you're trying to promote orcs to accept the orcs, or you're trying to promote goblins or anything within the caves and try and accept them, you're going to have a harder time doing so. So that's just more things to bear in mind and be annoyed with. So yeah, that's a noticeable debuff. And that's kind of a thing with dwarves, right? Is that they are good with that production efficiency and they are good with that construction time. But with dwarves, you don't really worry about scaling. You have dwarven holds, which are very, very strong. Yeah, and even your other terrain, the dwarf roads or the dwarven caves, tend to actually be pretty decent for scaling and building up your nation around. So that's not really your problem. The production efficiency is nice, but it's not like you need it. What you do need is stab cost modifiers for when you have your inevitable disasters. What you do need is global settler increase to help you colonize faster. What you do need is, well, decreases in dip tech cost, if anything, or even some dev cost modifiers to help you scale your country better. As kind of the thing with dwarves is they have their debuffs almost surgically engineered to extra hurt specifically dwarven builds. And the thing to also bear in mind is that if you are trying to play someone like Ruby Hold and forgo conventional dwarf gameplay to just blob across a tier, or, well, not even blob across any tier, just blob across Europe or Anbennar, sorry, it's not Europe, it's Escan or whatever, right? That's going to hurt. And a lot of dwarves are republics, and you have length of election term plus 12, so again, you're going to be re-electing by the second coming of the dwarf rule collapse. So again, not something you want to be doing. You don't really want to be a dwarven republic. But a lot of your content's built around being a Dwarven Republic, so it just makes it annoying. And it's one of the reasons I'm actually not a fan of the Dwarven Administration specifically. As ironic as it sounds, you should stick with Dwarven Administration because of their hold abilities, and the production efficiency still helps. But there's so many negatives in here, the dwarves are really dragged down by that, which is why I cannot give the dwarves anything higher than a B ranking, despite their best efforts and the 20 production efficiency being quite good. With that though, we move on to everyone's favourite, the trolls. The troll administration, I mean, you don't really get to see the trolls much outside of Op Troll and the... I think there's a couple other trolls beyond that, but they're not the most common, shall we say, administrations within Anbennar. So you don't tend to really get troll administration unless you specifically go for it. What troll administration has is minus 20% fort maintenance consistently, which makes them pretty good for defensive trolling builds. Rather ironic, I know. You get power projection from insults, which is neat, but okay. You get 15% nat tax, which is good early, but relatively falls off, and something to bear in mind. You get 10 province trade power modifier. That's actually reasonably nice. I'll take it. And you get minus 50 harsh treatment cost, which means that you'd look at that and go, it's very good for getting abs up to 100. You do, however, in your debuffs, pick up minus 5% admin efficiency. You also have female advisor chance 50% and the ability to recruit female generals, as well as minus 30% improved relations, plus 10 tech cost, plus 30 institution embracement cost, and plus 10% construction cost. What I find interesting with the institution embracement cost for the trolls is, unlike the elves, who have institution spread, the trolls don't really have a debuff to the spread, meaning that they can spread the institution, but they just have a bit of a more upfront cost towards embracing it. And I think institution embracement cost is a bit more manageable than institution spread, because institution spread means that if you're a super large empire, you're literally not going to be able to get to like 20% relatively reasonably. For the trolls, though, look, it's just expensive, but you can work around it. What you can't really work around is the minus 5% admin efficiency. You can't really work around the minus 30% improved relations. You can't really work around the plus 10% construction cost, and you really can't work around around the 10% tech cost. The fort maintenance, again, is only really good if you're fort spamming everywhere. The tax is nice early but falls off, and in general there's just a lot of issues with the troll administration specifically. Now, of course, nations like Obtroll get mission-specific bonuses that overcome some of the admin efficiency debuffs, literally plus 5 admin efficiency at the end of the game, but only if you have troll administration still running. But we do have to evaluate troll administration not as the strength of a specific mission tree, but as an administration as a whole. And there's way too many debuffs for way too few buffs, and the buffs that you do have are a bit all over the shop. Because, let's be honest here, construction cost is consistently painful. Tech cost is consistently painful. Minus 30 improved relations is consistently painful. Plus 30% institution embracement cost is consistently painful every time you embrace an institution. And minus 5% admin efficiency is consistently painful, just frankly if you're existing, unless you want to go dev-click the 5 provinces you start with as a troll. That minus 5% admin efficiency is gonna hurt. And it's going to hurt the more you try and build around it and stack it to overcome it, if that makes sense. So yeah, and your bonuses, if you're building around abs, bear in mind you're building around admin efficiency. Harsh treatment cost is neat. Your fort maintenance is great if you're playing a defensive absolutism build, and your tax is good so you don't financially ruin yourself early, but later on aren't great. Like, unironically, outside of the 15% tax, the province trade power modifier is probably a better bonus later. Now, national tax is obviously good early. I want to be absolutely clear here, because I spoke positively of the elven 10% tax, but the thing with tax that you have to bear in mind is that you want to pivot a tax economy into something else. And the elven economy with 10% tax into 10% production efficiency is just perfect for that, because you're buffing both. 15% tax early on is great for maintaining your early eco-scaling, and I guess specifically now, within the land the trolls are operating in, a bit less viable, but okay, it's good early, but it just doesn't really pivot into anything. And I think that's kind of a summary of the troll administration. Like, a lot of on-paper decent modifiers from that fort maintenance and harsh treatment cost, and even again 15 tax, but what do you build around this? A tax-heavy fort country that is very good at dealing with rebels sometimes. Yeah, I don't know what I'm looking at here. So I think trolls, unfortunately, are going to be our first entry into the C tier. So my significant apologies about that. But we now move on to everyone's not favorite elves, the Ruinborn. They are basically the New World elves, the ones that survived the big disaster that made all of the elves very sad. And the Ruinborn administration, well, it's a bit of a difficult one to flip out of, but it has some interesting things going on for them. So they used to have minus 5% admin efficiency. That is now gone. Instead, the Ruinborn get 20% domestic trade power, which, in my understanding, and I may be correct, I may be wrong here to be clear, I may be correct here implies that I'm mostly wrong, which is kind of ironic, but anyway, that Freudian slip aside, the 20% domestic trade power isn't great because domestic trade power out of every single source of trade power is actually bugged, and I believe doesn't actually apply, but I may be wrong here, or if at least it does apply, it applies at significantly reduced rates. Nevertheless, it's a bit whatever. The 15% reform progress growth right off the bat is actually quite good, and I think it's a relatively underrated ability to have reform progress growth off the bat. You're able to get a bunch of reforms faster, and the reforms have some good bonuses. Same religion advisor cost. Unless you're going for a humanist build, a lot of your religious advisors are going to have your religion, so that's actually just 10% advisor cost usually. And minimum authority on territories means that if you are going wide, that's just good. In terms of debuffs, you have minus 20 improved relations, which does make coalitions a bit more annoying, but something to bear in mind. And minus 15% institution spread is annoying. However, let's look at the positives here. There's not a lot of actual negatives, there's not a lot of drawbacks to have. Institution spread and improved relations are both manageable as debuffs. Minimum autonomy territories, though, is relatively hard to come by, and if you are doing a lot of trade company builds, then this is actually quite good. Unfortunately, in the New World, so that's a bit more awkward to do. But if you are somehow a Ruinborn that escapes the New World and wants to start setting up a trade company thing, or you're going for a true one-tag kind of build, this minimum autonomy territories is actually relatively helpful. I will have to concede, though, their specific positioning means that this minimum autonomy territories, I'm not going to be judging that positively, but the same religion advisor cost is just a nice thing to have. The reform progress growth is just a nice thing to have, and frankly pretty underrated. So the Ruinborn, while having absolutely nothing amazing, I think are actually putting in a pretty solid performance. And not much more to elaborate here, but I think they do just barely squeeze into the B tier as well. I'd probably chunk them a bit higher than Dwarfs, to be honest, but while nothing ecstatic or amazing from them, I think they're pretty consistently decent. And I think that's a fair summary to the Ruinborn. They used to be worse. But with that, we move on to Orc administrations. Orc administrations are also quite, shall we say, if that makes sense, interesting. I think I've said interesting quite a few times in this video, but yeah, a lot of modifiers here. Let's begin with the positives. Mil advisor cost minus 33%. Immediately, yes, good. Harsh treatment cost minus 25%. Not as amazing as minus 50, but as we're going to see soon, a bit more usable. 10% tax. Again, not great, but at least early on helps you keep that going. Minus 0.03 monthly war exhaustion. If you're bobbing or fighting a lot, this is great, as mentioned with the halflings, but you're able to do a bit more of an aggressive, should we say, expansion with the orcs, and I'll elaborate why later, because you also pick up minus 50% war taxes cost, less than you get to free war taxes quicker. You get minus 25% liberty desire from subjects development. Don't do subjects as orcs, I'll be honest, but if you do, at least they're a bit more loyal. You get minus 15 general cost, and you get a free leader without upkeep. You also get the ability to get female generals, you get 30% female advisor chance, and as for debuffs, you have minus 25% improved relations, you have plus 10 dev cost, you have minus 20% spy network construction, and plus 5% tech cost. So from the debuffs, the most painful thing you're actually going to deal with as an Orc administration if you're playing is going to be the plus 5% tech cost. That is annoying, that is going to be something that you have to go and overcome, and that is a drawback. However, let's look at your other drawbacks. You have plus 10 dev cost. You should not be deving as orcs, you should be conquering, because you have a lot of things that specifically not necessarily help you conquer, but help you maintain a military that can keep going and keep fighting. And so the dev cost, you're not really deving as orcs as much, or at least if you are, you shouldn't be. And the improved relations does hurt. It means the AE tech ticks down a lot slower, and it's something to bear in mind. But with orcs, you have a lot of bonus to specifically fighting long prolonged wars, so even if coalitions do fire, you can kind of just fight them, and I think that's kind of a summary of orcs, as it were. The spy network construction speed is annoying, but the thing to bear in mind with orcs again is that you tend to have your own specific orc CBs. You're in monstrous nations, you have monstrous conquests, and a lot of other things like that, so you kind of behave a bit more like a horde when it comes to CBs, and hence you don't really need to fabricate claims in the same way that other nations tend to do, so the spy network construction doesn't hurt that much. It's more noticeable in multiplayer if you're trying to do some counter-espionage or building spy network for siege ability, and if you are trying to build around siege ability, it's surely as noticeable. So all of these drawbacks that all of these drawbacks that we mentioned are existent, they're real, they do matter, but they're very mitigatable. Jesus Christ, words are hard today. So you can just play around them, and it's fine. But your buffs are very good at not necessarily winning wars, but I think the best way is prolonged warfare. War taxes cost at minus 50% to mean that either you're able to run war taxes for 1 mil point, which is actually almost reasonable right off the bat because of minus 15% land maintenance. That's just good, right? As well as some of the other things it gives you. But with it specifically, you're able to get some other minus 50% war taxes cost mod sources. There's a couple ways of getting it to run free war taxes. And free war taxes is great, but you need to be at war to use them. So there you go, another case of prolonged warfare. Mil advisor cost means that you can actually overcome the tech cost, at least for mil things, relatively reasonably by just able to run a more substantial mil advisor than you normally can. And it also means that right off the bat, and this is important, you're probably able to afford at least level 1 mil advisor, so you're able to pick up a military buff, such as some morale of armies or some discipline, and I think that's quite good. The harsh treatment cost, as you notice here, there's no debuffs to administrative efficiency for the orcs. So actually, with that, it helps you make a harsh treatment cost reduction spam build to get your abs up to 100%, which helps. And the only real debuff here that is annoying, or at least, sorry, the only real buff here that isn't really useful, I find, is limited desire from subjects development. You don't really tend to bother with subjects as orcs, I don't find. But if you're going for it, I guess it's not inherently a debuff. The general cost, though, is also nice. You're able to get a lot more generals and spam generals, and this is good for manpower as well, as you're able to slacken recruitment. And extra leaders now upkeep just means you're able to have more leaders around, and hence, it's just a nice bonus to have. It's a quality of life, but I'm not going to knock it down. Orcs are consistently good at just fighting a lot, and they're not really better at conquering as than other races, but they are, like, good at doing the conquering bit. They're not good at managing their conquest, but they're good at doing the conquering bit. And this should not be, like, knocked down. They're surprisingly good for blobby campaigns, and so I do believe that it's not unreasonable to also be putting the Orc Administration into A tier. With that, though, we are done with the Orcs, and we move on to the Ogres. As you can see, we're doing them in somewhat of an alphabetical order, if that makes sense. And the Ogres are, as much as it pains me to say this, just better trolls. So what do Ogres get? They get minus 50% harsh treatment, same as the Trolls, but they also get plus 30% foreign spy detection, minus 2 unrest, the same minus 20 fort maintenance, but they also pick up plus 10 goods produced and minus 10 liberty desiring subjects. For debuffs, you have plus 5 tech cost, that is still annoying, minus 30 improved relations, that's still annoying, plus 25% state maintenance. One day state maintenance will do something, but honestly that's a negligible modifier, minus 20 spy network construction, and minus 10% global trade power. Now, global trade power is annoying. Tech cost, again, I mentioned plus 5% tech cost, you have to mitigate that. The improved relations does hurt, even for something like the Orcs, minus 25%, this minus 30 improved relations is painful. You're going to be running into more coalition issues because of that. And the state maintenance technically doesn't help your economy. But what helps your economy is 10 goods produced. This is huge. This is just straight up better than the production efficiency that the dwarves get. This is a massive economic bonus and should not be underrated. Liberty design subjects, it's flat 10%. It's, again, don't bother with subjects if you're an ogre, but it's there. Harsh treatment cost of minus 50% means that you can actually do a harsh treatment absolutism build a lot easier. You're already halfway for stacking the modifier to be harsh treating for practically free and getting your absolutism going. And notice you don't have any admin efficiency debuffs in ogres, so that's good for you. And you're just even better for blobbing for that because you have some minus 2 unrest, so you can get away with it a lot more. It also means that because you're comfortably playing wide now, unlike the Trolls with that minus 5% admin efficiency, that fort maintenance actually comes in a bit more because that means you're able to spam and afford forts everywhere a lot more consistently. And the foreign spy detection is cosmetic, that does nothing, let's be honest. Ogres are very good with that goods produced to be able to actually have a large economy and to be able to afford all of their conquests and things that they're doing. Well, they don't have any specific buffs to conquests. That harsh treatment cost is surprisingly useful. The unrest of minus 2 is surprisingly useful. And again, the fort maintenance actually comes in, I find, a bit more for the ogres than it does for the trolls. Unless, again, you're specifically building around fort maintenance with trolls. Anyway, I value the ogre fort maintenance a bit more because you're meant to be a bit more of a conquering kind of nation here, so you're just going to have more provinces to shove more forts in. So yeah, ogres, again, much like, I think, orcs, very good and conquering, but unlike orcs, I think that goods produced actually means that they can use a lot more of the land and get a lot more money than they can out of the land that they conquer, and hence are actually just good at running their land. I think that good produced 10% bonus is a bit too strong, because it means that ogres are one of the best economic administrations in the game. And I know this is going to be sounding sacrilegious, but if you're playing as a dwarf because you have access to some trolls relatively close to you, you should consider flipping into Ogre Administration. The 10% construction time reduction you'd lose is annoying, sure, but make sure you just keep tolerating the dwarves so you can actually keep using your holds. And Ogre Administration on dwarves is just really, really strong, so that's something you should bear in mind. So yeah, ogres, consistently nice. They're not amazing, they're not like the best you have in the game, but a solid A tier if I ever saw it. And with that, with the ogres complete, we move on to the Mekanim, or, well, basically mechanism, but we've skipped an S to be cool. As you can tell by their, shall we say, more of a drawn complexion, they're not fully implemented, and you'll be able to certainly see that in the military section later, as they have a bonus applying on a national level that cannot apply on a national level, can only apply on a unit level. But nevertheless, we are talking about their administration at the moment, and the Mekanim administration is fascinating. They pick up minus 15% construction time, helping them scale a lot faster. They pick up the 10% production efficiency that the elves and the dwarves have better, but they also get minus 7.5% tech cost. I'm not sure why not minus 10%, but sure, minus 7.5 tech cost and minus 10% idea cost right away. They're capped at 5 terms for some reason. I'm not sure why. Specifically, having a mechanism of administration means you can't be elected more than 5 times. But they also have plus 20 length of election time. So yeah, don't be a republic if you're a Mekanim. You get female advisor chance and the ability to recruit female generals. What about your debuffs? Well, you get minus 10% trade efficiency, and that's painful. You get minus 25% spinal construction, that's annoying. You get minus 33% foreign spy detection, minus 15% improve relations, and minus 1 dip relation, and you also get plus 2.5% or power cost. Now, what this actually means is that deving for you is a bit more painful, because you have plus 2.5% dev cost, and you'd think your tech would be a bit more painful, but you actually have minus 5% tech cost and minus 7.5% idea cost. And that idea cost means that Mekanim administration is actually really strong. There's not that many bonuses to idea cost right off the bat, and it's an off-rip idea cost that you can have for the entire game, saving you 40 monarch points per idea that you're grabbing, and you're usually filling out ideas. The production efficiency also helps, and the construction time helps you scale quite a bit faster. That minus 15% is genuinely quite substantial. That said, though, economically, 10% trade efficiency hurts. Dip relations and improve relations hurts, but dip relations is really playable around. If you really want to spam vassals, dip relations is a bit annoying, but you're probably not spamming vassals as Mekanim, let's be honest. And the improve relations of minus 15%, yeah, it's annoying, but I mean, it's just annoying. I was going to say but manageable, it really isn't. That is just bad. Spy network construction also does hurt you as a Mekanim because you actually need to build spy networks, and the all power cost again is just consistently annoying. I don't think they're as awful as some of the other administrations. The idea cost makes them quite viable, specifically early on, but I would recommend if you are Mekanim and it's not too painful to switch out of it later, because that all power cost is going to hurt you if you're coring or frankly playing the game. So that's a summary on that regard. Otherwise, I think they're interesting. I'm going to be looking forward to more Mekanim content being introduced to Anbennar, but I can't rank them too highly, and that hurts me because 10% idea cost off rip and 5% tech cost, well, it's more of like minus 7.5% idea cost, let's be clear. Like, those are pretty strong modifiers, but given the all power cost bonuses, I say bonuses negative, I can't put them above a B, I'm sorry. But yeah, that's them, and we now move on to the lizards. The lizards are also relatively new, but unlike the Mekanim, they're actually implemented, which is good. And I mean, they were the last update, to be clear, so I'd hope they were actually completed. But the lizards, in terms of their bonuses, pick up minus 50% change rival cost. That does nothing. 15 production efficiency. That's good. A free admin policy. That's neat. That's nice. A possible advisor and minus 10% same religion advisor cost. Again, much like the who are they? The Ruinborn. The same religion advisor. You're able to run your religion advisors pretty consistently. So that's nice. Debuffs wise, though. Plus 10% stab cost is annoying, minus 10 trade efficiency is annoying, construction time is annoying, and minus 1 dip rep is also just a bit more annoying. So the question is, what do you get to make up for those debuffs? The free admin policy is good, the production efficiency is nice. It's not a long list, it's a bit more of a slowed down administration, there's not too much going on in that regard, and the free administration policy need to actually use that bonus. The thing you have to bear in mind is that if you're thinking, okay, the free admin policy can offset the trade efficiency, when do you actually get your second admin policy to be able to use it? And if you do get a really strong second admin policy, get the government reform for a free admin policy from the clergy, right? So the question always becomes, when do you get the third admin policy? And by the time you get the third admin policy that's good, and you want to run it, it's a nice modifier. But you've had minus 10 trade efficiency and plus 10 construction time the whole time you've had this this buff of free administration policy. So yes, of course, eventually the free admin policy will cancel it out to some regard, but 10% trade efficiency in 1650 is not as good as 10% trade efficiency in 1450 because the value of money is significantly less in 1650 than it is in 1450. And production efficiency is a nice bonus for later, but you can't really build around trade because you also have that 10% trade efficiency debuff. So it's a bit of a, what am I doing with Lizardfolk administration as a build? And the other bonus you have here of the change rival cost, just I think it's another case that we've seen earlier with the trolls of like, what am I doing with this country? Their bonuses are just a bit too over the shop, and the issue is their debuffs, the trade efficiency, the stamp cost, and the construction time are consistently, like, they're consistently mediocrely bad, and their buffs of the 15 production efficiency is the only consistently nice thing, but free admin policy is very inconsistently nice sometimes. And the same religion advisor cost can sometimes miss, but okay, it's also inconsistently meh. And I think the consistent debuffs outweigh the consistent buffs and the potential sometimes niceness. So I think Lizardfolk are also going to be making our second entry into the C tier. Sorry, I'm just not a fan of their administration. I think there are certainly better options. But with that, we move on to everyone's favorite, the Kobolds. The Kobolds are relatively rare as well, although I think that because dragons are cool and Kobolds are related to dragons, and Kobolds tend to be more of a challenge start, I think Kobolds are disproportionately popular for that reason. But the Kobolds also, well, they don't have a lot going for them, but they have a lot of interesting things going for them. So the Kobolds get 10% production efficiency, not 15, but they also get minus 10 dev cost and 20 global settlers. That's it. In terms of debuffs, you get minus 10 tax, minus 10 trade efficiency, and minus 0.5 interest per annum. So what do the Kobolds do in this regard? Well, early on, they're going to struggle with money because of minus 10 tax. Late game, they're going to struggle with money because of minus 10% trade efficiency. They're going to struggle with debt, or if they're ever losing, they're going to lose harder because of that interest per annum. It's going to be annoying. Now, this interest per annum does not affect burger loans. You should be taking burger loans, it's something to bear in mind, but that is consistently bad and consistent debuffs. But what the Kobold administration also does have is 10% production efficiency, does at least somewhat mitigate some of your economic debuffs, and plus 10% dev cost is just good. It is very hard to argue against 10% dev cost. Now, all of the land they have isn't good for deving, but it's there, and global settler increase is also just nice. There's a lot of land to colonize in Anbennar. The Kobolds, and this is going to sound very specific, but are very carried in the way that a lot of their administration actually comes to overpower their debuffs. And if you're playing Kobolds well, it's a bit like the Dwarfs, where the Dwarfs, if you're doing well, have a lot of bonuses and hence can scale well, but have a lot of, if you start losing, you start losing hard. And that's the same for the Kobolds. The 10% trade, the minus 10% trade efficiency means that if you start losing money, you're going to have a bit of a harder time getting money. If you and early on, if you're struggling with money, the tax is going to hurt you. And if you ever end up going into debt, the interest per annum is going to make it more painful. However, if you're doing well with the Kobolds, the dev cost is going to be extra valuable. If you're doing well with the Kobolds, the global settler is going to be extra valuable. And the production efficiency, again, helps you offset those bonuses. And so this sounds a lot like the Dwarves, right? But the key difference is the Dwarves have 15 more billion disasters that they have to go through all the time. So the stab cost hurts them a lot extra. The Kobolds, once you overcome your initial enemies and once you're a bit more established, it's actually relatively smooth sailing. Remember, interest per annum doesn't do anything if you don't have loans, and if you're only running burger loans, you're just fine. And dev cost is consistently good. And yes, of course, 10% tax hurts, but if you are already building around trade and goods produced, yeah, the trade efficiency is noticeable, but you can outclick that with 10% dev cost. You can just get 10% more development to have than the 10% trade efficiency. It also make for very good, like, you know, Kobolds produce a trade, then you have another ally, if it's usually a human for this specifically, they pass the trade, ideally a halfling, and they collect the trade and subsidize you back. That makes for a good, like, you know, partnership in that regard. But the Kobold administration is, like, very dwarvy in their setup, that when they do well, and when they do badly, they do badly. But I value that more for the Kobolds, because the Kobolds, again, don't have all of the disasters that dwarves do. So I'm actually going to be relatively positive in the Kobold ranking here. I think their administration is relatively underrated, and while their bonuses are significant, sorry, their negatives are significant, they do hurt, you can very much play around them. Now, are those bonuses great? 10% dev cost, you have to build around it. And to be punished by 0.5 interest per annum, that's just playing the game, getting some unlucky events and getting some things. So, despite all of this praise, I still can't rank them any higher than B. But to be honest, I think they're just about escaping the C tier given the scale of their drawbacks. But that's the Kobolds for you. That's their administration. And we'll now move on to the Hobgoblins. The Hobgoblins are relatively rare in Anbennar as well, but the command is still an interesting country to play, and I think they have quite the mission tree and, content around that, for lack of a better word. The Hobgoblin administration has +5 tax and +5 production efficiency. Slow down their Anbennar, don't want to give them too many bonuses, and -1 unrest, okay. As well as -25% harsh treatment cost and some monthly war exhaustion ticker. In some ways, we're basically just seeing a worth troll administration at the moment. But their relatively big bonus is +10 max abs. That means that if you're building around max abs, which you should be if you're Hobgoblin and you're trying to build around Conquest, this is good. This lets you run an extra pilgrimage or two. In terms of debuffs, though, you get -1 diplomats. That's annoying, especially for blobbing. -10 global trade power, consistently annoying. Institution embracement cost, consistently annoying. And dip tag cost, consistently annoying. In essence, Hobgoblins are a weaker troll that is technically a bit better at managing their absolutism, but it plays as a weaker troll, and that diplomat still hurts for them. You at least are able to not have to worry about the extra tech cost things going for you that way. But yeah, I think weaker troll is a good summary of the Hobgoblins in terms of how they play, I'm afraid. So yeah, it's another solid B tier pick. If you want to if you're looking at the Hobgoblin administration going, I want to make a build around that, just play the trolls instead. So yeah, that's Hobgoblins. Now we have to move on to Harpies. Harpies, in terms of their lore, I do have to quickly mention that you either love them or you hate them. It's a contentious, shall we say, administration and also way of playing the game. But we're here to talk about modifiers, and Harpies have some interesting things going for them. Harpies have -50 envoy travel time, which for blobbing campaigns is absolutely incredible. You're going to be sending your diplomats out a lot to make peace deals. You have +10 GovCap modifier, which is huge. That's great. It helps you manage your big empires and literally govern them. This is good. You have +15 improved relations. This is good. This helps you manage AE. You have +10 max absolutism. This is again just good. This helps you blob and build around admin efficiency. You have -5 liberty design subjects and -5 liberty design from subject development. Which means if you do also want to be picking up early subjects, or later on you are blobbing and grabbing subjects, this isn't good for a subject build, but what this is good specifically is that if you are expanding faster than your admin can keep up, you're able to release subjects or have a bunch of subjects in places and then come back to them later. In fact, you don't actually have any specific bonuses to core creation cost or debuffs to core creation cost, meaning you can still do a Harpy vassal build, and this helps you into keeping them loyal if you want to spam them. But it also means that if you are ever in a situation where you are struggling and you're overextended and you release a bunch of subjects, they're going to be more likely to be loyal, so that's just a nice consistent bonus. You also pick up Chance of New Air, which is pure flavor, and I find tends to be relatively irrelevant, but whatever, it's there. You get 150% female advisor chance, which is complete overkill. The base female advisor chance in the game is 2%, and the way female advisor chance works in the EU4 is that every time you roll a advisor, you have a base female advisor rate of 2%, and if you have +5% female advisor chance, you go from having 2% female advisors to 7% female advisors. What that means is that at +98% female advisor chance, your female advisor chance becomes 100%, so every single time you roll a advisor, you actually get a female one. With 150% female advisor chance, that means every time the Harpies roll an advisor, 0.52 new Harpies appear, so like, yeah, they're 100 and... I don't know how to basically phrase this, but they have an extra 52% female advisor chance that is entirely redundant. You can make your jokes about that. My go-to joke here that I kind of failed in the execution was going to be that every time the Harpies spawn a woman, they get a 0.52 more women on top of that as well. Nevertheless, though, that's not really a debuff. That's just, okay, women are in charge of a country now. You do, however, in terms of the debuff, get -10% tax. Early on, that's annoying. You have -10%... Sorry, not minus, +10% build cost and +10% build time. That is bad for scaling, and you have +10% advisor cost. And the issue with that is, of course, you want to have a lot of advisors because you're going to be doing a lot of expansion, and so, you're going to slow down your scaling. But Harpies, once they overcome their initial, bump, because they're relatively weak early, the build time and build cost and 10 tax and advisor cost means their early game is relatively miserable, have a really, really good set of bonuses for blobbing. Max abs helps you get your absolutism up, GovCap helps you manage your empire, envoy travel time is frankly invaluable, and if you start combining with other envoy travel time reductions, you're able to get it to something stupid like -100%, and hence just have instant envoy travel time. This is an incredible quality of life and just a very nice bonus to have for your blobbing campaigns. They are very, very good at blobbing, and of course they have the bit of an early game debuff. They have a bit of that hump to get over, But once they do get over that hump, and once they've survived that early game, as it were, and then once they start expanding, they are really, really strong. The other thing to bear in mind with Harpies as well is they are monstrous, which means they get access to the monstrous conquest CBs, which are just good for blobbing in that regard as well. So yeah, they are consistently good. And for managing large empires, what also have to realize is that build costs and build time is annoying, and this is true. However, if you conquer manufactories that other people have built, build costs and build time is a bit less relevant on that regard. So yeah, just positives all around. And for your early blobbing, yeah, you have less money and, you know, you're spending even more money on advisors and even more money on buildings for blobbing, but you also have improved relations buff. So you actually are able to hit the ground running as well, even if it's harder for you to run, because you have some more AE reduction tickets. So just positives all the way around to say around the Harpy administration. And for that reason, because they are so almost custom built for mid to late game conquest, Harpy administration will be our first entry into the S tier. Congratulations, Harpies. With that, though, we move on from the Harpies to the Harimari. And, you know, if I've been very positive about the Harimari blobbing ability, about the Harpy blobbing abilities, the Harimari are built to just be amazing. I'm sorry. What do the Harimari get? They get plus 5% admin efficiency, minus 10 idea cost, and max promoted culture, and plus 100% vassal force limit. As debuffs, they get plus 5% tech cost, which is annoying, you have to manage it. Yearly corruption, which if you have taken a lot of overextension, can be even more annoying and is something you have to work around, but it's something you can work around. You have minus 20 ship trade power. You know my opinion about light ships at this point, and if you don't, this modifier does nothing. I do not see any impact from minus 20 ship trade power. And minus 20 seduction spread is the only real debuff here that you can't really manage, because plus 5 tech cost is annoying. But as a Harimari, your whole thing is blob and conquer the world and manage it. And I'd rather have plus 5 tech cost and minus 10 idea cost than any other kind of combination of that. Idea cost right off the bat is really, really strong. It lets you scale and make your build go up quite a bit faster. And if you're trying to grab something like diplomatic or admin ideas, then the core creation cost here is just amazing. You go grab it and you're happy. The max promoted culture is just a nice thing to have. You get an extra promoted culture, extra administration and stuff. The 5% admin efficiency, though, is just incredible. It is probably the single strongest modifier from administration I've seen, full stop, for blobbing. And if you're stacking admin efficiency, it's incredible. So yeah, just again, thumbs up all around for the Harimari administration in that regard. And the vassal force limit contribution, just a little bit of a cherry on top. If you are spamming vassals or you are playing the Gen and Raj, it's almost custom built for that. You're getting a lot more troops from your vassals. So yeah, it's just a strong modifier if you're bothering with vassals. You're normally not. But the thing to bear in mind with the Harimari, of course, is that vassal force limit also applies to colonies, which means that if you end up colonizing, the Harimari are actually one of the best people for extracting force limit out of colonies, which is even more helpful for blobbing. They are just amazing, I'm sorry. So the Harimari administration will be joining the Harpies rightfully at the top of S tier. So that's the Harimaris done. We now move on to the Half-Orcs, which probably going to be a bit more disappointing now. I'm guessing, you know, I've just spent all this time typing up the Harimari. The Orcs, a bit more of a concise list. They inherit the human or power cost modifier. It's kind of their main bonus of the humans. But they also pick up 20% Mil Advisor cost reduction. So again, I think that's enough to help them run a Mil Advisor early and also have the minus 15% leader cost from the Orc, shall we say, bonus list. They get 30% female advisor chance, but they get plus 15% improved relations and plus 15% stab cost. That 15 stab cost is bad. You have to manage it, and at least you're not dwarven, so you don't have that many disasters, but it's something to bear in mind. Your stability is going to be a bit more annoying, and your coalitions are going to be something that's more substantial. But the Half-Orc administration, in many ways, is kind of the better parts of the Orcish administration distilled in a more chill format. Leader cost and be able to spam leaders is nice to be able to have a lot of manpower and keep fighting. Mil Advisor cost lets you grab a bit more of, well, either a high-level Mil Advisor or an early Mil Advisor for some fighting abilities early. And there's just not a lot of debuffs for Half-Orc administration. And the bonuses, you do have the all-power cost, the leader cost. Yeah, it's just nice. They also have some of the, well, I say some, they have the highest base reduction on leaders with almost 20% off your generals because you have minus 17.5% because remember, all-power cost is leader cost. So yeah, great for spamming generals, great for prolonged fighting. Half-Orc administration is, I think, very underrated and I think should be used more. I know Half-Orcs and lore tend to not be seen very favorably by the player base, and this list isn't as impressive as it thinks, but it synergizes relatively well with itself, And yes, you do miss out on a bunch of some of the other orc bonuses, like the harsh treatment cost. You also miss out on some of the more crippling debuffs from orcs as well. And so I think it's just consistently good. Half-Orc administration is a very, like, workhorse fighting nation, if that makes sense. So if you're planning on doing a lot of consistent fighting, Half-Orcs get you there without significant debuffs to your country in the process. And so I think for me, Half-Orcs are just about going to squeeze out the actual orcs in the administration category. So there we go, that's the Half-Orcs, and we now move on to Goblins. Goblins. So, not that many Goblins around as it stands. I mean, there's certainly options for you to play, but I think the world is relatively underpopulated compared to Goblins. But they have some interesting things going for them. They have -10 mil tech cost, which is neat and quite a substantial bonus. They also don't have any other flat tech cost later in the debuffs, but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. They have +10 production efficiency, +20 spine of construction speed, which they're monstrous. It's nice in multiplayer for microing it, but I'm not going to value it that highly. But they also have -5% dev cost. In terms of debuffs, though, they have +10 advisor cost, -50 national tax, and +10% dip tech cost. Dip tech cost is annoying here. The dev cost means that you want to be deving as gobbos, and +10% dip tech cost means that a bit harder for you to dev as gobbos because you're going to be spending more dip points on your diplomatic technology that you'd ideally be putting into your nation deving. The tech cost and the advisor cost, the tax modifier and the advisor cost means that your early game scaling is a bit more miserable, but you do emerge out of your early game scaling with some nice production efficiency bonuses, and your mil tech cost means that you're actually able to keep up on mil tech surprisingly well and at least have that category sorted. So yeah, Goblins they're not as strong as some of the other things, but they're very, I think, actually genuinely underrated. And what we have to realize is that they're surprisingly synergistic in terms of survive the early game and then do quite well. Dev cost -5% is consistently nice. Production efficiency without any debuffs to trade is consistently nice. 10% mil tech cost lets you time your wars and like grab mil tech in single player act more aggressively to fight stronger opponents. And also in multiplayer lets you keep up on mil tech a bit better, and means that you're spending less mil points on mil tech, meaning that you have more mil points to dev and have a bit more manpower as well. The drawbacks can just be outscaled. 10%, like, that's the other thing to also realize with Goblins, is that you can outscale 10% advisor cost, you can outscale -15% tax. And the dip tech cost, while you can't really outscale that, you can be at a point where if you're behind on dip tech, it's not the end of the world. It's probably the most okay to be behind on dip tech out of every single technologies. So, like, if that's the bit that's hurting you, it can hurt you, it's okay. And it's surprisingly synergistic in what it does with that production efficiency and deving with dip, and also the mil tech cost being able to have more mil points to dev with, right? So the main like debuff here is actually the dip tech cost, but once you've mitigated that, Goblins are surprisingly consistently good, and I think frankly pretty underrated as well. I think Goblin administrations also have some little buffs to Artificery, although I'm not too sure about that, or at least a bit more access to it. So overall, I think it's the case of, well, the ability to outscale your debuffs, that's important. And that kind of like bit of early game suffering for late game neat stuff also means that Goblins for me are A tier. If we're judging pure early game potential, straight to C, no question about it, even considering a D, but very overcomable debuffs, and definitely an A tier administration once you've done that. Alright, but that's the Goblins. We now move on to everyone's favourite, the Gnomes, or as I like to call them, Gnomes, because it pisses off all the Gnome enjoyers. So what do the Gnomes have access to? Well, of course, their main thing is Artificery. They're also a very tall build with 15% production efficiency, and no real debuffs to trade. But they get, as well, on top of that, -5% tech cost, which is good. Foreign spy detection, whatever. Spinal construction, okay. And 33% innovative gain. That's actually nice. You can be able to get innovators going up faster. And if you get your innovative completed a bit ahead of time compared to everyone else, okay, you're able to, you know, get some bonuses going. Where innovativeness, I think, really shines is that if you do stick around long enough for the big cube religion, you're able to cash in innovativeness for monarch points, or at least there's a mechanic where you're able to gain innovativeness, or if you can't gain innovativeness, you're able to cash in your paper points that are cube points into monarch points instead. So for that reason, I think it's nice. But with Gnomes, make sure you also are not a Republic, because that length of election term sucks. And you're actually just very debuffed, and this is going to hurt to say, Minus 30 global settlers is bad because you tend to want to colonize. Minus 5% admin efficiency is bad because you tend to want to play the game. And minus 1% mission strength is bad because you tend to want to play the game. Humanist gnomes don't tend to be a thing because usually if you are playing, well, sorry, not gnomes, gnomes, you're trying to go for things like innovative ideas or trying to build around artificery and so on. So you don't really tend to have a slot for tolerance ideas. So that missionary strength just hurts. And it also means that any kind of religious conversion build is inherently worse with them. State maintenance is a bit whatever. And so it's just, frankly, artificery with the hopium, right? And the tech cost does synergize relatively well with that. And in many ways, the gnomes are just very, very hard carried by artificery. That said, and this is probably going to be not very popular, minus 5 admin efficiency is bad. Global settlers, if you're trying to colonize, is bad. And you don't exactly have any dev costs or anything that really encourages Torpay outside of the production efficiency. So what do you actually have as gnomes, right? You have a little bit of tech cost, you have a bit of an inventiveness with that innovativeness, and you have production efficiency, but so do half the other races. And if you really want production efficiency, build a workshop everywhere. Like, I mean, you should be doing that anyway, but you know, it's hard because they're a bit weird in how they play. In a way that they're playing very mission tree dependent. But once you realize that outside of Nimskod, like a lot of the buffs that makes gnomes good aren't actually based on administration. A lot of the buffs that makes gnomes good are based on Nimskod or religious things that you lack in innovativeness. In terms of the actual administration, Nimskod will be significantly stronger if you flip to a different administration. And that's kind of my point here. So for that, unfortunately, I really, despite that early access to artificery, look, if you're playing a gnome, grab your artificery and move on. But I can't have them higher than a C tier. I'm sorry, that's just unreasonable to say. But with the gnome bullying aside, we now move on to the gnolls, or the gnolls if you want to be annoying. And so what do the gnolls have? Well, actually quite a list of bonuses. They're a bit all over the shop though. I think if there's any kind of other shizo administration or, well, race really, it's the gnolls. They're just so all over the shop. First of all, you pick up +1 attrition for enemies. This is good, right? No one's going to look at the gnolls +1 attrition for enemies and go, I'm not a fan. You also get minus 20% unjust demands. This is good for blobbing. You get plus 10% production efficiency. Okay, another economic bonus. Neat. Same as the gnolls, but sorry, same as the gnomes, but worse. Like, okay, it's another economic bonus. -1 unrest. I can see a combo here. They're good for blobbing without unjustified demands. Plus the merchant trade power. Okay, where is merchant trade power good? It's if you get enough trade range to shove a merchant somewhere, and then steer with it. Okay, Liberty Design, same continent subjects. Okay, so you're a vassal build, but not really. You're partially a vassal build. I'm just going to ignore that. You get the ability to raid coast, so again, you're very good at grabbing small islands everywhere for raiding coast, and the ability to shove merchants there, and you have less of a hard time grabbing those islands from unjustified demands and holding onto them from the national unrest. And you pick up some Yellow Republican tradition and Yellow legitimacy. Okay. But as debuffs, you get -15 improved relations, so your blobbing is actually harder because you have more AE problems. You are, well, a monster, so Spinal of Construction doesn't do much for you, but you have plus 33% stab cost modifier, which, yeah, you're not a dwarf, but that's still just miserable. You have -10 tax, so your early economy sucks. And you have -1 prestige, you have +1 prestige decay, which again makes maintaining 100 prestige and maintaining a reductions in general AE things more painful. You have monthly air claim strength increase, which means that combined with your legitimacy, once you have a guy in charge, it's easy for them to get in charge, but successions are made even more painful, especially with that stab cost modifier. So you're an unstable nation that's good at blobbing, but like blobbing in a very specific way of grabbing random small islands everywhere to be able to raid coasts and shove merchants. I mean, lore accurate, strong, not really. The production efficiency 10% is nice, but not enough to overcome the early tax debuffs, and let's be honest, you're making most of your money from raiding coast if you're playing as a gnoll. Merchant trade power means, okay, you can actually get some trade things going because you go from +5 to +8, so if you place your merchants, big bonuses, good, but merchant trade power is mainly powerful in inland nodes, and you have the ability to raid coasts. So, what? It's the ultimate all-over-the-shop combination, and it's a bit like humans in the sense that they are very mediocrely good at like doing everything, but like they're not inherently awful for conquest. Unjustified demands and -1 unrest is still nice. It's just then your liberty desire in continent subjects isn't that helpful, and the plus 33% stamp cost hurts extra mad if you have like 500% overextension and so on and so forth. So it's like, what am I doing with them? What am I doing with the Gnolls? And I guess the answer is whatever I want, but I'll let them go into B tier. They're not quite the Gnome, like, weirdness, I'll be honest, but like I can't do anything higher than that, and I think it's unfair to put them lower as well. So that's that, and then with that we finally arrive at our last administration. That is, of course, going to be the Centaur administration. So what is the Centaur build? They have plus 30% caravan trade power, that's good in inland nodes. They have plus -20 harsh treatment cost, good for blobbing, -10 minimum autonomy in territories, and here we have to say, they have a lot of trade company regions, so this is good. They have cost to move capital, this is good for moving your capital for a trade company region. They have -25 envoy travel time, good for blobbing. As debuffs, they get plus 10 stamp cost modifier, a bit annoying, but at least manageable as 10 admin a pop, and -30 spine evo construction speed. You're monstrous, that does nothing. The thing with Centaurs is that you have exactly one debuff that matters, plus 10% stamp cost, and it's not the end of the world. It's a very manageable debuffs. And the bonuses that you do have are very concrete. Harsh treatment cost, like, is a bit of a nice thing bonus for stacking abs. The Minotaur territories is significantly better for specifically Centaurs, because they tend to exist in areas where there's a lot of trade company, like, land to be made. And they're extra good with trade companies because of that caravan trade power, and the envoy travel times helps them blob, so consistently nice in that regard. The Centaurs frankly put in a good show for a blobbing campaign, but it's a trade company blobbing campaign. So just do that, and it's a good bonus for Centaurs, because specifically a trade company blobbing campaign is like a strong campaign to do. So an A tier entry on that. Right, but that does kind of wrap up the administrations, which means now it's time to talk about militaries. So we're back to the humans, everyone's favorite, and the humans have no debuffs. Pretty common theme by now, I guess, but they pick up plus 5% morale of armies and plus 5% morale of navies. Don't disregard an extra plus 5% morale of armies or navies, it's not the end of the world. It also means that if you do get poor uniforms, it's also not the end of the world that you got the event. But the thing to bear in mind with specifically something like that is that it's just consistently nice. You're never going to go, oh, I have too much morale. If you're stacking morale, it helps. If you're not stacking morale, you're stacking discipline, it helps you have a bit more morale. Morale of navies also very slightly is a naval buff, but it does mean that if you ever do end up fighting navally, it's neat and helps. So yeah, another positive on that regard. Very hard to say anything negative about the humans, but again, in an environment where builds beat generically decent builds, if that makes sense, like you want to specialize instead of being a jack of all trades, this 5% morale of armies, unless you're stacking morale, isn't going to be the best. So again, humans are going to be, yet again, very comfortably sitting in the B tier. So there we go, I'll put them next to the human administration as well. Well, I guess I'll put them at the back here, so all the admins will be there, and then military will come afterwards. But okay, that's the humans. After that, though, we move on to halflings. So, let's start talking positives. The halflings get plus 10% land force summit, plus 10% manpower recovery, plus 10% sailor recovery, plus 5% land fire damage, minus 10 morale damage received, and 20% national supply limit modifier. However, they also suffer from plus 20% cav cost, minus 10 shock damage, plus 10 shock damage received, and regiment drill loss of 25%. It does mean that if you are trying to drill your halfling troops, you're going to have a harder time and they will decay faster. It also means that because it's harder to drill them and you're going to have less drill on your troops on average, you're going to be able to mitigate less shock damage from drill specifically. So they are very good at, well, basically halflings struggle against cow builds and are not good at fighting cow builds. However, minus 10 morale damage received means that they will stay in the battle longer against the cav build, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword because instead of running away, they're just going to sit there and die, more so than ever. And they're not very good at their own cav because they have minus 10 shock damage and plus 20 cav cost. So don't do halfling cavalry. That's not a thing that happens. You get a bit of a lot of troops kind of thing. You're a bit of a mild swarm military, if that makes sense, because of that 10% force summit and 10% manpower recovery. but it's not great. Your main bonus is actually supply limit modifier, so you're just not good, as ironic as it sounds. And the plus 10 shock damage received, like, okay, plus 5 fire damage does nothing for the vast majority of the game, and by the time it matters, you already have like so many idea groups and it's so later into the campaign that the ability to field a larger army is more important than plus 5 land fire damage. So plus 5 land fire damage is an insignificant enough modifier. Halflings are also not exactly easy access to Artificery, so it's not an easy thing to stack. But what does matter for Halflings is the shock damage and shock damage received. Those things both hurt for it, and the fact that their cav early on is expensive and cav is good early on. They're going to struggle fighting early, and they're not going to get anything good picking up later. And it's all well and good having 10% more troops, but if your 10% troops, melt significantly faster, it's just not good. Halflings are not good at fighting. Don't fight with Halflings. They're not, like, abysmal to fight with, but anything above a C tier is just dishonest. So that's it. That's the Halflings. And with that, we move on to the Half-Elves. So Half-Elves have minus 10% leader cost, and then they have some land leader fire and leader siege pips, plus 1, both good. Minus 10 morale damage received, which is quite helpful, as well as 0.5 yearly army and navy tradition. Excellent. In terms of debuffs though, they have plus 5% regiment cost, a bit annoying but manageable. Minus 15% manpower, annoying and manageable, but minus 15% land force modifier is just bad and you have to kind of play around it. It's equivalent to the grain plus 20% buff, as in, well, not exactly equivalent, but you almost want to make sure you're trading in grain to overcome it. That reduction in troop count, as well as the reduction in manpower, is noticeable and is an issue and something to bear in mind. What Half-Elves do, though, very well is become generals. Their extra yearly army tradition, even if it's 0.5, helps them roll better generals. They have a land leader, fire, and siege pips, and they can reroll cheaper. That's kind of the Half-Elf thing. If you're stacking leader cost and you're stacking general ability, it's nice. Problem is that A, good generals don't win wars on their own. B, if you want the best generals, go play a mage. And Half-Elves do play mages. But it's not max land leader fire or max land leader siege, and this doesn't affect war mages as far as I'm aware. So it's like, okay, your average general is going to be significantly better. Okay, it's good for general builds. Literally, not as a general build, but as fighting general builds. That's about it. And I think that's kind of the issue, is that, ironically, as it sounds, are you willing to have minus 15% land force limit and minus 15% manpower just for some consistently better generals, but not the best generals, because the best generals are still war mages? And usually the answer is no. So Half-Elves, for me, have noticeable debuffs that are significant for a build that loses to someone that just runs a war wizard. And that, to me, is an epitome of a C-tier build. Like, it's not abysmal, it's playable, but it's bad. With that, though, we move on to Elves. Now, Elves are probably one of the longest lists we're going to see here. They open with an incredible plus 10% discipline, 15% movement speed, minus 1 yearly army tradition decay, plus 100% drill gain modifier, so excellent for elite troops again, minus 15 land attrition, minus 25 drill decay modifier, minus 20 attrition when loaded on ships, which is noticeable, but sure. Minus 2 Navy Tradition Decay, which is actually an incredible economic modifier, as it gives you an effective plus 40% trade steering, and minus 25 Naval Attrition. So far, so absolutely amazing. And I mean, 10 Discipline on its own is Discipline meant permanently. But as debuffs, Manpower Recovery Speed, minus 50%. You are gonna struggle maintaining your manpower and fighting elves. This is not something you can outscale, this is just a continuous reality. Minus 25% Sailor Recovery Speed. That is also a bit more overcomable, but noticeable. Minus 33% Reinforced Speed. That is painful. You almost have to grab defensive ideas just to neutralize that. Plus 50 Reduced War Exhaustion cost. For prolonged fighting or fighting coalitions, this is painful and noticeable and bad. Minus 10 Merc Discipline. Don't run Mercs as elves. Minus 30 Merc Manpower. Don't run Mercs as elves. Plus 30% Merc Maintenance. Again, don't run Mercs as elves. And the problem is, because of all those manpower debuffs, you kind of want to run mercenaries as elves. So they're very... If you win hard. If you start losing, you better make sure you're careful with losing. Now, multiplayer, if you're allowed to be a player subject, there's a wonderful, wonderful thing you can do called become an autonomous vassal, and then your overlord can send you manpower. So what you can do is become an elf autonomous subject, stack discipline to the absolute moon, and have absolutely no manpower going for you. Then just go to your overlord and say, hey, can you send me manpower? And they go, yeah, sure, and you're just fine. This is because there's a transitive property in Anbennar where if you have an elven military and 100 like goblins arrive in your court, they immediately become elves and immediately join your elven army. Stop asking questions. But I think that's more on the exploit side. Otherwise, though, they're just strong. Yearly army tradition decay of -1 is even better than a 0.5 ticker that the half-elves get and can maintain really good army tradition consistently, so they're not even going to have bad generals. They're going to have +10 discipline for crying out loud. Movement speed means they'll be able to take fights or even leave fights or get out of fights if they don't want to be in that fights. It's just good things, and -15 land attrition means that the manpower they do have, they're going to be able to use for longer. Elven militaries are very much, if you want to win, this is your win harder, this is your win better option. But you have to be careful with elven militaries. You have to know what you're doing with elven militaries. It's not a generic turn your brain off and go win the war. You have to manage them. And if you play elves correctly and you play them well, they are undeniably S tier. But, much like dwarves, when they start going bad, when you start running out of manpower and you start running into issues, they're going to really struggle. And because of that, can't really put them into S tier. I think they're going to have to go into A tier. Because in wars, very few times are you ever in a situation where everything goes according to plan perfectly every time. And so, if you ever do start running into issues as elves, you're going to start running into issues as elves. But that's elves, right? That's, we've moved on for them. What about the dwarven military? I've been a bit harsh, shall we say, to the dwarves, so surely their military is going to be nicer. Well, in terms of bonuses, you have -10 shock damage received, meaning that dwarves are surprisingly good at fighting cavalry. They also get +20 artillery damage from back row, meaning that dwarves are just very good at having cannons. They also have +1 artillery level available versus forts, which is good because dwarves end up sieging a lot of forts, and once they leave the fort, you know, the dwarf roar and all those things, yeah, it's just going to be good at sieging, as well as has 10% siege ability, on top of +10 fort defense. Nice, but not the greatest fort build, and -15% drill decay. So far, so good on the positives. On the negatives, though, global regiment cost +15% can get painful. -10 movement cost can get painful. -20 manpower recovery speed can also be annoying. It's not as bad as the elven debuffs, but it's bad. +20 camp cost. Don't do dwarf cavalry. I know there's some ram riders. Don't do dwarf cavalry, especially with -25% cap to infantry ratio. Those are both significant bad debuffs you can mitigate by just not doing cavalry. You also get -25% sailor recovery speed. Oh no. -10 light ship combat ability enjoyer. The one light ship combat ability enjoyer out there is now, you know, he's never playing a dwarf, never again. -20 galley combat ability, that's bad. -10 transport combat ability. I mean, 0 -10% is still 0, so that modifier just exists to waste my time talking about it. In essence, unless you do heavy ships, you're not good at boat. What are you good at? You're good at cannon, and you're good at siege, and that's kind of about it. Be careful though, the movement cost means that you might be forced to take bad battles that you don't want, and the manpower recovery speed means that you really want to ideally be killing your enemies or letting them attrition on your forts or your holds, instead of actually engaging in prolonged attrition warfare. Surprisingly, as dwarves, you're not going to do too well on that prolonged attrition warfare because of the manpower recovery speed, but you're going to be pretty consistently good at fighting battles and winning, and the siege ability on turret levels versus forts is very, very good in single player, where a lot of your fighting is actually just glorified siege races. You have more of like 3 to 4 siege races for every battle you're actually taking. So I think that's a very consistently nice modifiers for that purpose. And the manpower recovery speed is even mitigated somewhat by the -10% shock damage received, which in the early game is just very nice and can combine very well with the dwarves' access to things like mithril, which gives you, like, I think -1% shock damage received per mithril you have access to. So all the way around, actually, dwarves fight consistency pretty well. I think, ironically, it's the consistency for the dwarves. Nothing incredibly flashy, but their consistently strong performance is going to be taking the dwarves into the A tier as well. So there we go. That's dwarves. But now we have to move on to the trolls. How do the trolls fare? Well, as bonuses, they have +25% shock damage, which is incredible. They pick up +5% morale damage, which, given that you're dealing +25% shock damage, I think that's just morale damage for the player you're fighting against. This is actually cosmetic. This is just, you know, if you're fighting against the player or the AI, they take 5% morale damage because they know you have +25% shock damage. You also pick up an incredible -10 fire damage and 20% shock damage received, which is just great. You have +25% reinforcement speed, which is incredible. You have +50 recover army morale speed, which is absurd. You recover your morale in 2 ticks globally. It's incredible. It's genuinely an incredible modifier. Like, recover army morale speed is amazing. Because the way it works is that Normally you have 10% recovery, so it takes you like 10 months to recover your morale, but you get like plus 10% if you're on home territory or whatever. No, no, no. As trolls, you can genuinely go from unpaid to troops to full morale in one tick. So you can actually troll the AI, literally as trolls, by not paying for your troops. The AI will go into the battle, lock in, and as long as there's a month tick before that, you can pay for your troops and basically recover your entire morale. And also that means that you're significantly less punished for not paying for your troops. And on top of all of that, you pick up 100% garrison damage, which means sallying out of forts as trolls is quite effective, and you have fort damage. So, sorry, fort defense. So even more garrison damage indirectly, because fort defense and defensiveness of the forts impacts your garrison damage, right? So far, so good. As debuffs though, recruitment speed plus 100% is annoying, but it's something you can play around. It's just bear in mind, rebuilding your troops takes a while. Minus 30 land force limit is bad. It is just bad, but you kind of make up for it with quality. You don't do boats because you have minus 50% naval force limit, and your troops that you do have, they may be very good, but you have 15% less manpower. Now, 15% manpower, 15, not 50, is more mitigatable than the Elven. Sorry, they have 15% global manpower, not minus 50. So it's something to bear in mind. Like, you do have a slight debuff to manpower, but you can most certainly mitigate it. You also have plus 10 infantry cost. Now, infantry is not the most expensive, but it's something to bear in mind as well. Like, your troops are a bit more expensive, not troops, your troops. And you also have plus 75% ship cost. That can annoy. Basically, don't build troll navy. And of course, to 50% ship recruitment speed. You are very, very bad at boat. Don't do boat. But the debuffs you actually have to your standing army, the infantry cost, is a bit, like, mitigatable. The global manpower modifier is mitigatable. The recruitment speed is absolutely mitigatable. And you have some incredible fighting buffs without any real debuffs. You're consistently good at fighting. So for that reason, troll military is an excellent entry into the S tier. Like, they are just good at fighting. With that though, we move on to the Ruinborn. Your bonuses. You get minus 10 shock damage received. Not useless. You pick up minus 30 land attrition. Nice, you just don't really take that much attrition. And you get a land leader maneuver. This helps you move faster and take less attrition. As debuffs, you get minus 15 reinforced speed. This is annoying. You get minus 10% sailors. That's annoying. You get plus 10% morale hit when losing a ship. Because of how naval combat works, this is probably one of the most worst things you can do. As a Ruinborn naval military, you have to pop in and win naval battles immediately, because the moment you start losing ships, all your ships are going to start shattering in front of your eyes, because that's the biggest morale damage in, like, naval combat, is when you lose a ship. So the moment you start losing naval battles, you've lost naval battles. Like, are they incredibly abysmal? No, but honestly, like, the argument is between B and C tier for them. They're basically slightly weaker humans because they don't have 5% morale. That's kind of the summary in the Ruinborn. They're pretty forgettable. So yeah, not something you have to switch out of as a top priority, but not the greatest thing that ever existed of all time. With that said though, we move on to Orcs. Orcs pick up plus 15 shock damage, minus 5 fire damage received, minus 15% shock damage received, 20 global manpower, 10 manpower recovery, 50% army tradition from battles, and 33% looting speed. Basically, you're consistently just pretty good at fighting. 15 shock damage means that you're actually pretty good at Orc cavalry. Minus 5% fire damage received means that people that build around fire damage can have a slightly harder time fighting you. Minus 15% shock damage received means you're actually very good at fighting cavalry builds. 20% global manpower is just nice and consistently good, as well as the manpower recovery, so you can have a lot of orcs to do your fighting. Nothing a bit over the shop, but yeah, consistently nice bonuses. Unfortunately, your debuffs start being an issue. Minus 10 land fire damage means late game you scale pretty badly. Minus 10 artillery combat ability just means, again, you're forced into a shock build without a cav crutch, so you're going to struggle. Minus 20 fort defense means that you're going to lose siege races, which is what a lot of fighting is. Minus 10 siege ability means you lose siege races even harder. And plus 20% fort maintenance means that you want to build less forts because that fort maintenance can start adding up. And it means mass spam 14 builds can be a bit more annoying. Orcs are very good early game. If this was a ranking in the early game, Orcs would comfortably sit at A tier. But they fall off, and they fall off hard. And for that reason, I really am going to have to just put them into B tier. They're not as good as shock builds as something like cav builds. They're not like as dominant early game as even something like elves. Elves just beat orcs early on because they have enough quality to handle the orc bonuses. They're not good enough to overcome like the dwarf shock damage received and their eventual specific builds and their sieges. The dwarves just outsiege orcs. Yeah. bit of a disappointment, really. If you want to be fighting as the orcs, you want to, you know, run as... So, to be clear, I think orcs are slightly better than humans in terms of military abilities. But, like, I think their administration is more warlike than their actual fighting ability. Like, they want to fight. They're just not as amazing as fighting as someone a bit more committed to the act, as it were. But there we go. That's the orcs. And with that, we move on to the ogres. The ogres are, again, a bit similar to the trolls, but here's the thing. They pick up plus 25 shock damage. So far, so good. Minus 15% shock damage received. Again, a great counter to cav builds. Plus 15 recovery army morale speed. Again, it's a troll, but worse. Plus 10 siege ability. That's nice. And minus 20 land attrition. Unfortunately, though, they have a pretty crippling plus 10% global regiment cost. Which, I mean, it is like infantry cost, but just also plus 20 artillery. So again, hurts your siege ability. Plus 50% recruitment speed. Mitigatable. Minus 20 land force limit. That's more annoying. Minus 15 manpower recovery speed. That's annoying. Minus 10 movement speed. That's annoying. You also are not allowed cavalry. Counter infantry ratio is reduced by 25%, and cav flanking ability is also reduced by 50. Ideally, you want your cav to be flanking, so that cost hurts. But at least you're not abysmal at boats. You're allowed just plus 10 global ship cost, but you can actually boat somewhat better than trolls. Unfortunately, trolls are just better than ogres at fighting. Like, okay, the trolls aren't good at boat, but the ogres aren't exactly going to be running a naval empire, so great, you've lost some naval debuffs. Oh no. But you still have most of your land force limit reductions, and you're not as amazing at everything else for stacking damage received modifiers. You just die to cannons later on, because yeah, your shock's pretty good, but that's there. And you're kind of weird with your siege ability, because you both have buffs to siege ability, but you also have global regiment cost, which makes artillery more expensive. They're not bad. I think they still consistently fight pretty well. It's just the land force limit and manpower recovery and movement speed debuffs mean they're not quite at the troll level for fighting. So while I'm comfortable giving them the bottom of A tier, I can't really rank them any higher than that. Consistently neat, but not ridiculous. With that, though, we have the Awoken. And there's a problem with the Awoken, is that I believe that... Sorry, the Awoken mechanism. Because that's the one culture from the Mekanim, is the Awoken Mekanim. So that's why in my notes I have them written as Awoken Mekanim. But yeah, the Awoken Mekanim, all of that weird disclaimer to the side. They have a very specific bonus that a lot of their build relies on, and that is regiment manpower usage minus 10%. Unfortunately, if you apply regiment manpower usage on a national level like this, because I've tried it, it doesn't actually mean that your regiments use 10% less manpower. Because the way that would work is that if you would have, like, if you've taken 1,000 casualties, you need 900 men to reinforce all 1,000 of those casualties. But that only applies on a regimental level. If you give regiment manpower usage on a national level, this does nothing. So we have to rank them with that in mind, and what that means is that their actual bonuses are minus 33 attrition, plus 20% fort defense, and minus 20 fire and shock damage received. In terms of their other bonuses, they can also not build over force limit. I'm not sure why the inability to build over force limit is listed as a bonus, but it's there. Okay, so you take minus 25 fire and shock damage received. This kind of makes you a worse troll, to be honest. But it's something. What about your debuffs? Well, you get minus 5 morale of armies, already annoying. You get minus 15% manpower recovery, minus 15 sailors. Okay, minus 20 force limit, that's more annoying. Plus 20% regiment cost, that's bad. Plus 10 morale hit when losing a ship, so you still can't boat. Minus 5% merc discipline, so your disciplines are worse. And reduce morale damage taken by reserves minus 10%, meaning that you take more morale damage in reserves, so you have to reinforce better and, in general, fight consistently worse. You have minus 20 fire and shock damage received, but if you're making a build around fire and shock damage received, you want to do trolls. They just do the troll bit, but significantly worse. Their forts aren't as good, and the land attrition is reduced, but I think their main selling point of their military ability just doesn't work. Now, if that regiment manpower usage worked, I think they'll make a comfortable entry into the B tier. The problem is that they have the elven debuff of not having a lot of troops, and troops that in theory are pretty good, but fire damage received and shock damage received doesn't mean that you're immune to stack wipes. The morale armies means that you're going to be losing battles and getting stack wiped. You're going to have less troops, basically just a very difficult and a lot of debuffs to try and justify the minus 20 fire and shock damage received. And again, if you want to stack fire and shock damage received, there are better nations for it. If this was vanilla, that would be great, but because they are literally broken in some senses, They just straight up don't work, and like it's a C tier nation. Honestly, I was thinking D tier, but like for D tier you have to be really, really bad. And yeah, I think they're worse than human military, but they are still at least somewhat like playable. But there we go. All right, that's the Awoken. Who do we have next after that? Sorry, the Mekanim. We have the Lizardfolk. They open with another -5 fire damage and -15% shock damage received, but they pick up Morale of Navies, great, and Global Sailors, great, and Capture Ship Chance, great, and Global Ship Cost, great, and Allow Marines, yay. In return, you have +20 Cav cost, okay, no Cav Lizards, -10 Siege ability, -15 Reinforce speed, -5% Recover Army Morale speed, -5 Morale of Armies, and +10 Regiment cost. They're just not good at fighting, I'll be honest with you. They're okay on the water, but they're only okay on the water because they can capture ships. No, I cannot in good faith endorse Lizardfolk militaries. They're just bad. If you're playing as Lizardfolk, try and flip out of Lizardfolk army as fast as you can. But with that, we move on to the Kobolds. The Kobolds have -10 fire damage received, so later on they're a bit better at resisting fire damage, but they also pick up 25% manpower recovery. Yep, there's a lot of those bastards, and 20% force limit, that's good. They also reinforce relatively quickly at +15%. They have a land leader maneuver pip, so they can move around. They loot faster, which is fair, and they also have a nice artificery bonus of +5%, which is surprisingly good. Like, artificery is strong, right? But if you're doing Kobold artificery, you're just better off doing Gnome artificery, to be honest, so I wouldn't recommend running that. And in return, you suffer -5 morale of armies, which is annoying. You take 10% shock damage, which is brutal. And you're bad at cavalry and ships, because your Galley combat ability is reduced by 20% and your cav cost is +20. So you just don't fight very well, I'll be honest. Like, by the time the fire damage matters, it doesn't. And you're another nation that has a swarm army that comes in and does things. Your artificery regiments of +5% are just going to sit there and remind you that there are nations that do artificery better than you, and I guess you're nice at looting things. But again, if you're Kobold military, flip out of Kobold military. Early on, you're going to take a lot of damage. You have a lot of troops that die extra hard, and eventually -10 fire damage. I think by the time that matters, it honestly doesn't. I don't really see the value of the Kobold military, I'm sorry. Like, you can also do a bunch of trap things around building fort defense things, but if you want to do a fort defense build, like, I guess Kobolds aren't awful at it, but ironically Trolls are just better. So yeah, D tier, I'm sorry, Kobolds are just not good at fighting. But there we go, that's the Kobolds for you. After the Kobolds though, we will now be reviewing the Hobgoblins, and well, that's going to be quite a bit of an upgrade. The Hobgoblins pick up 5% discipline, -5% morale damage received, plus 100% drill gain modifier, and -25% drill decay, as well as 20% global manpower. In return though, they suffer the following debuffs: -50% reinforce speed, and +50% merc manpower, and -75% merc manpower, and +50% merc maintenance. Don't run mercenaries if you're Hobgoblin. Be cautious because your reinforcement speed is reduced, but you have a consistent +5 discipline, that's very nice, and you have more manpower on a +5 discipline nation. You're basically the best of the Orc and Elven world. You just fight consistently very well, and I think this is kind of the big comparison of Hobgoblin versus Elves, is that yeah, you're 5 discipline behind, but you actually have buffs to manpower compared to debuffs on it, and you just... It's the case of jack of all trades, but you do everything at that 80% rate, where you're down 5% discipline, but you still have a good quality army. You have less morale damage received. You can do a lot of drills, so you can at least somewhat mitigate your lack of fire or shock damage received, and you have a lot of manpower. It's not a large list, but it's a good list. And so, an excellent entry. Frankly, like, it's either top of A tier or bottom of S tier, and I think top of A tier is... It will be reasonable, but to be fully honest, like, I think it's more of a case of their nation as well. The boar command and the command itself is quite a powerful thing, but it has its own drawbacks. I've actually, and this is going to sound again sacrilegious, but I've flipped into Hobgoblin military a couple times, and I think it just works consistently well, because almost any build you're doing just works with it. Yeah, I mean, I think they're just consistently good. I'm sorry. I think Hobgoblins will be going into the S tier. So that's them done. And with the Hobgoblins sorted, we now move on to the Harpy military. So they're very good at administration. Surely they're very good at fighting. Well, they have 33% movement speed, as well as minus 10 shock damage received, which early on actually does matter. They have plus 10 fire damage, which early on doesn't matter. By the time it matters is, well, I mean, you can kind of build around fire damage, but sure. Minus 10 land attrition, that's nice. Siege ability, that's nice. Chance to capture enemy ships. Harpy infantry flanking range +1 is nice, but bear in mind to flank you have to outnumber the enemy. So if you're not outnumbering the enemy, this doesn't do much. Unfortunately, you also suffer from minus 10 artillery combat ability, which kind of mitigates a lot of the plus 10 fire damage. You also have plus 10 morale damage received. You have minus 10 fort defense, plus 10 fort maintenance, and minus 5 morale of armies. Harpies are good at running away. I think that's a pretty reasonable summary, and you can do a fighting retreat with Harpies, but you're not really good at siege races because your siege ability doesn't offset the fact that you have minus 10 fort defense. You're good at choosing to not take fights, but you can't choose to not take fights forever. Once you are in the fight, you take a lot more morale damage, and you don't really deal that much damage back out. And yes, you have minus 10 shock damage received, but you have plus 10 morale damage received, so you would just take more morale damage and lose fights. Harpies are just not good at fighting, I'm afraid. Yeah, I don't really have anything going for them, and they're a bit all over the shop. They're just not great. I'm sorry, they're going into the D tier as well. But alright, if that's the Harpies, surely the Harimari are an improvement. And Harimari pick up plus 10 ICA, which is great right off the bat, plus 15 shock damage right off the bat, great. Plus 10 movement speed, very useful for catching all those running away chaps, and some prestige from land battles, as well as some army tradition from battles. Good stuff. Unfortunately, you have minus 0.2 artillery fire. Make sure you pick up a pet dwarf for you to help you overcome that 0.2 artillery fire, but honestly, you can overcome that as well. Like, Spain has plus 1 artillery fire. They don't immediately win every single combat ever. Like, it's a small debuff, but it's fine. Land Leader Fire -1 also hurts. They're very, shock damage, shock infantry build. Global regiment cost, noticeable, but it's overcomable. And the global supply limit is probably the most annoying thing with there. The Harimari are similar to something like the Elves and Dwarves in that they are consistently reasonable. They're not quite as strong in their consistency as the Hobgoblins, but I think they put up a good enough shock infantry showing for the A tier. They fight very well compared to, honestly, the average species as well. So, yeah. Good at fighting. Not a free win button, but good at fighting. With that, we move on to Half-Orcs. Picking up plus 10 shock damage, minus 5% shock damage received, 15 global manpower, and plus 10 manpower recovery speed. A bit of a swarm, but without the force limit. But they also have fort defense debuffs, minus 10 land fire damage, and plus 10 fort maintenance. Half-Orcs defend their forts by not really having forts and just kind of fighting on every single fort, which is fine. The minus 5 fire damage received can be very easily overcome, and they're just consistently nice to have. Plus 10 shock damage, minus 5 shock damage received. Consistent small bonuses. It's very hard to complain about them. But unfortunately, it's just a case of consistently reasonable, so into the B tier they go as well. Right, that's Half-Orcs. What about everyone's favorite now, the Goblins? So, what do the Goblins pick up? They pick up plus 15 land fire damage, plus 20 global manpower, plus 15 manpower recovery, plus 10 siege ability, plus 10 reinforced speed, plus 15 land maintenance, and minus 10 land maintenance modifier, minus 10% artillery cost, and plus 5 artificers. Again, they can artificery. They're not the best at artificery, but they can do it. That said, though, they are good at sieging. They are good at dealing fire damage. Plus 15 fire damage is starting to be noticeable. There's a lot of those masters with manpower recovery speed and global manpower modifier. They're reinforced faster. And again, land maintenance and land forcer means you can mass fuel them quite well. In terms of debuffs, though, they do take plus 10% fire and shock damage and plus 10 morale damage. So they're pretty good at running away. And as always, they're not good at boats or cavalry. So plus 20 cav cost means don't do Gnoll cavalry. Sorry, not Gnoll, Goblin cavalry. You can do Goblin cavalry. It's just more expensive. Wouldn't recommend bothering with it. And if you're going to do boats, do heavy ships, not galleys. So that's that. Thing is, they're a swarm race because fire and shock damage received hurts. But they're kind of good at what they do. They're good at fire damage. They're good at sieging. They're good at having a lot of artillery. And they have plentiful armies that aren't bad, they dish out a decent amount of damage, and there's just a lot of those bastards as well. More force limit, more maintenance, and more manpower and manpower recovery means you can get a lot of these gobbos going. And that's noticeable. I think gobbo armies are pretty underrated, and so yeah, I will also be entering them into the A tier. Just making sure here on OBS, though, as I just want to, we don't like exit the frame. There we go, perfect. Just to readjust that, be a bit awkward if we're cutting anything off. But yeah, that's that. With that though, we move on to the gnomes. They have plus 10 artillery compatibility, plus 1 artillery levels available versus forts, much like the dwarves do, but they also have plus 10 heavy ship compatibility and plus 12 allowed artificery faction. Now, they also get an extra bonus for their artificery, giving them plus 0.1 infantry fire and 15 infantry compatibility, which is really strong. But their bonuses include, negatives include minus 15 infantry compatibility, so you want to run artificery with them and kind of mitigate that, as well as minus 15 manpower recovery speed, plus 20 cavalry cost, and minus 20 galley compatibility. So if you're running boats as gnomes, make sure you run heavy ships and don't run cavalry, and just run artificery. And this is actually extra true because of their allowed artificery fractions. They are mainly an artificery build, and the thing is, artificery can be very, very strong for the gnomes, and in general, just very strong as well. So if you want to play around with artificery gnomes make an excellent artificery build. And the bonuses they do have may not be a lot of them, but the artillery compatibility stacks very well with all the fire damage that artificery has access to. The artillery level available versus forts means they're good at sieging, and they don't have any other major debuffs outside of that are really noticeable. The manpower recovery speed of minus 15% is annoying, but can be mitigated. So honestly, the one thing I will have to say about the gnomes, surprisingly good at fighting. Early on can be a bit weak, but I think they really put up a very good showing and very consistently good as well. So an excellent other entry into the A tier. With that though, we move on to the gnolls. Plus 10 shock damage and plus 10 morale damage. Yeah, they are kind of a morale break right off the bat. Well, military from that. But they also pick up 10% manpower recovery, that's helpful. Minus 10 land attrition, that's helpful. Minus 10 land maintenance modifier, okay, a bit more on the swarmy side. Plus 10 movement speed and 33% looting speed. So far, nothing too amazing. And unfortunately, with plus 10 fire damage received, minus 10% fort damage, minus 10 ship durability, and a navy tradition decay, gnolls are actually pretty bad at naval combat, and in terms of their on-the-ground fighting, if you can not break in the shock phase or resist their morale damage, which they don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot of other things going for them. They're kind of swarmy without the land maintenance to make up for the, well, not without the land maintenance, without the force limit to justify the swarm. So 10% manpower recovery helps you field a bit more troops, and land maintenance helps you afford them a bit more, but not anything too substantial. Well, they're not as abysmal, and I won't think that they're a straight-up downgrade. Later on, they do just die to fire damage, and they're not very good at resisting sieges without fort defense. They're also not good at naval fighting, not as abysmal as plus 10 morale damage from ships sunk, but they're not good on the water. They're mediocre at best on land, kind of swarmy. It's like they are basically the very top of C tier. I think they're playable. I wouldn't recommend ever switching into them. And with that, we finally arrive at the final person on our list, the Centaurs. The Centaurs have minus 50 cav cost, which is absolutely amazing for cav builds. They have plus 10 cav compatibility, which is absolutely amazing for cav builds. They have 0.25 cav shock, which is incredibly amazing for cav builds. They have plus 50% cav to infantry ratio, which is incredible for cav builds because you want it. You have plus 50% cav flanking ability, which is again incredible for cav builds because that means when you flank harder and you win harder. And you have 30% movement speed, so you can catch out the enemy even more. They are cav build on crack cocaine. They have basically the best cavalry in the game. And if you really want to experience peak Centaur cavalry, Marhold with Centaur military is incredibly strong for a reason. Debuffs though, they're minus 10 at land fire damage. That's okay, most of your damage is going to be coming from cavalry. Artillery compatibility minus 20% is bad, but because it's such a strong cavalry build, you're not using the artillery for fighting, you're using it for sieging. Minus 20% manpower recovery speed is noticeable and something to bear in mind, but the thing with cav builds is that because if you full send cavalry, your cavalry tends to be so strong, you can kind of just, you don't need as much manpower because you can kill so many enemies. National sailors means you're going to have a hard time having a navy. Fort defense, siege ability minus 20%, they also have minus 20% fort defense to be clear, is annoying, so you're going to have to still build cannons to help siege things faster. The fort defense means that you're not going to be able to be on the defensive that much, but you can still force people to take bad fights on your forts. And you have minus 30% morale of navies, so your boats are going to be terrible. And your garrison size means, again, people are going to have a relatively easy time assaulting you. Very volatile build. You cannot into boat. Just get that away, straight away into your, understanding. Centaurs cannot boat. And your forts are very flimsy and vulnerable. Forts for you mainly exist for the purpose of catching off the enemy. You're also not going to be good at siege racing. If you're in single player or even multiplayer, don't try and siege race. Just, for all intents and purposes, kill the enemy. Once you've killed them, you can, you don't need to siege race because you're not racing against anyone. You can just go win. But the amount of cavalry bonuses you have here, especially in an environment like Anbennar, which really has a lot of cav things, means that Centaurs very comfortably also enter the S tier for me for military rankings. But there we go. There is the full tier list for you to take a look at. Feel free to, again, jump back and see my justifications if you skip forward in the video just to see this final tier list. No worries about that. But unfortunately, that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, but a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Slemen, Ozendika, Nekas, Nanhatan, Star72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best for Gaming, Gramil Flavia, Labarule, W Haste, Sol, Anthony35, Macy Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Dunray, Marvy, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, and Twynet.